So this video will be on some small historical information related both to your readings on Gloria, Anzaldua and Americo Paredes, as well as some general history of the Texas-Mexico relationship that helps set up where we're going to be starting. This comes under the broader heading of history for the course. So we'll begin with Gloria Anzaldua, who is a very famous writer, theorist, cultural thinker in Chicano and Latino studies, and died recently. I guess it's been 10 years, died in 2004. She was, during her time, very well known for not only Chicano-Latino cultural rights and issues, but within that specifically Latinas, women, and feminist agendas as well. She was born in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas and grew up there her whole life. She experienced poverty and moving out of the valley and attaining her education. She worked alongside her parents in the fields as a sharecropper, as well as a migrant worker throughout Arkansas and Texas. She worked in these fields even after her father's death through high school and college. She gained her BA in 1969 and a master's degree shortly thereafter, both of these coming from Texas. The chapter we read comes from her book, which is her most famous work, the 1987 publication called Borderlands, La Frontera. We read the first chapter here, and a little bit later in the course we'll read another chapter. But this chapter is the beginning of her own personal sort of historical framework of who she is as a Latina, looking back across the river into Mexico and recognizing that the border, the physical border, is a part of who she is, and that's where her concept of borderlands, this sort of muddied or blurred idea of identity, becomes the running theme throughout the book. This chapter focuses largely on a specific personal gaze as she looks back, and within her, the history of the area sort of rises up, and she merges her personal history with sort of a more standard textbook history of the events that happen. And she puts this all together, and she uses Spanish and English and song lyrics and poetry and personal writing in a way that creates sort of a collage of different types of voices, all relating about the same thing. And the book itself, the entirety of the book itself, is very well known for this. And when we talk about Anzaldua, a lot of times we'll use the term that linguists have used, referred to as code switching. Code switching is shifting between different types of speech, and that could be anything from actual language, from Spanish to English, to one's different type of formality, one's type of tone, one's audience, one's form of writing. All of those are codes that Anzaldua uses to, in this chapter anyway, to get at a personal history that she wants to express. So the chapter is both sort of communal, in that it talks about the Texas Mexican and beyond that the Aztecs and the prior to the conquistadors history, and then her own personal history. Okay? I want you to refer to, and you can go to your Blackboard page to find this, a history PowerPoint presentation on Texas and Mexico. And if you can follow along or refer to this later. The maps on this list are real broad in terms of their coverage, but what I want you to see here is a sort of generalized view of the relationship of the United States to Mexico. So the first slide there you'll look at, this is an 1803 map of the United States, and the major land purchase of this time, orchestrated by Thomas Jefferson from the French, was, those of us that grew up in Nebraska will recognize the monumental moment in time, the Louisiana Purchase. All of the land west of the Mississippi River there, all the way up into northern Montana and down into parts of what is now Texas as well. All of this was purchased and soon after was going to be explored very famously by Lewis and Clark expedition, etc. But in 1803, one of the highlights here that you'll want to notice is that the Florida Peninsula and much of the southern ports of what is Alabama today and Mississippi today and Louisiana was still Spanish territory at this time. Look closely at the borders there, and the black border immediately above Florida represents the end of the United States territory at this time. So largely, and you might get an answer to why that Louisiana Purchase section narrows down to such a small little bit of land at the base of the Mississippi River, is because this gives us access to water in that area. You know, you don't get all of Texas, but and all of present-day Louisiana even, but you do get that port entrance to the Gulf of Mexico that was very important at the time. Okay, if you go to the next slide, what you have here is a few years later, the 1819 version of the map. And you can look at the sort of color-coded disbursement of land belonging to whom. But at this time, at the onset of what is known as the Adams-Onis Treaty, Spain cedes modern-day Florida to the United States. So that peninsula that we were looking at in the previous slide is now United States territory. And this also sets up the border between the Spanish territory and the U.S. western frontier at what is known as the Sabina River. Okay, and now this is a good time to make mention that all of what we know today as Mexico and all of that sort of beige-orange territory there was under Spanish rule, New Spain, in fact. Okay, and all the way, notice how far this goes up, all the way into Nevada and all of California and Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming even, and then states below that as well. All of that is Spanish territory. And you see the border that's established at the 1819 treaty. Okay, if you go to the next slide, 1821 is a monumental year in Mexican history. Okay, this is the independence of Mexico from Spanish rule. And this is what the map, this is a very basic map, but if you look at the colors, you notice that Mexico has been established as its own country, and Spain still controls, look, if you look in the Caribbean, that's Cuba there, and some other island nations as well that are under Spanish control, but Mexico is now its own country. The United States in the dark green is still bordering Mexico at a much, much more northern border than is presently observed. That's 1821, Mexican independence. Next slide begins the onset of the dispute between the United States and Mexico. In 1836, Republic of Texas is established. Okay, if you look down, you've got that oddly shaped gray area, the Republic of Texas. Okay, that makes mention of. Let me zoom in here a little bit so I can see it better. This is an area that begins to develop by Tejanos, Tejanos or Texanos, Tejanos, who are Mexicans living in Texas, and they establish this republic. Because it is so far removed from the central government of Mexico, it sort of develops its own autonomous ruling for a while. Texas has a long history of this sort of independent, autocratic sense of identity, which is why we call it the Lone Star State, because it believes it stands on its own. At this time also, Anglos began to slowly cross the border and settle in this area and make commerce and make just sort of an existent way of life with Tejanos living in the area. And as the slide says there, over time, the Anglo-Texans grew to be more populous and more dominant in this area over some time. I also want you to pay attention to that pink area right next to, which is West Texas nowadays. This is a disputed area, okay, and we're going to look at that in a minute as to what's exactly disputed there. Go to slide number 5. The bright yellow area is this Republic of Texas, which lasts for 9 years, and during this time, the racial tensions, ethnic violence between Tejanos and Anglo-Texans really begins to rise, right? Dominance over who has more right to rule this area. Eventually, the presence of Anglos in the region and the vast distance from central Mexican rule made this area a cutoff from central Mexico rule and became annexed to the United States in 1846. Still, you see the disputed area to the left. And what this is largely the area defined as, is that United States, is that Mexico, or often forgotten, what presence do the Indians, the Native Americans, have in that area as well. And this is going to be the onset of some war. Whoops, I get a little ahead there. This is a close-up. If you go to slide number 6, this is the close-up of the tip of southern Texas. This is land that was involved as part of this dispute. If you notice on the north, there is a border marked as the Nueces River. And according to the Mexican observation of the annexation, this was to be the border between the United States and Mexico. And on the south, you'll see what we know of today as the modern Mexico-U.S. river or border, the Rio Grande River. Both governments, both militaries disputed which border would be used, the Nueces on the north or the Rio Grande on the south. And so the United States troops invaded this region and began a war in 1846 with Mexico. After this war was over, very famous moment that we're going to refer to several different moments in this class, but in 1848, February 2nd to be exact, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends this war between the United States and Mexico. And all of that area, that close-up area that we were looking at, was ceded to the United States, transferred on that day through documents, as well as, if you look at this particular slide, all of that pinkish, reddish area of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. All of this area was transferred to the United States. And if you look at the inset map, you'll see what was Mexico before 1836. And now you can see all of that, basically, just about basically, what is today modern-day United States comes into being on that because of that treaty. This is a major moment in world history as well as U.S. history that this gives us the modern-day American Southwest. Next slide will show you just a little bit of a trivia. But the land of southern New Mexico and Arizona, that's part of what's known as the Gadsden Purchase, came a few years later, and ultimately was because of a railroad being built through this area, not being able to get through. So this was purchased from the United States, and then we had our complete full-on version of what the United States looks at. And I believe our next slide. Yes, slide number 9, you can see by the time 1860 rolls around, and they're getting ready for an 1860 election, this is what the United States map would have looked like. And the continental U.S. is all there at this point. Some of it is unorganized territory still, and some of it is still borders will change and that sort of thing. But it's all been constituted by virtue of war, treaty, purchase, and exploration, and we have reached the western coast and fulfilled manifest destiny. This history is something that Borderlands, the book, and Gloria Anzaldua, the author, fold into her opening chapter. Okay? She uses this book, which again I said came out in 1987. This was a crucial moment in the study of Latinas, specifically in Latino studies. And she uses this history here to begin investigating who she is, who she comes from. If you open your Anzaldua, the homeland Aztlan, it begins with a poem, and we'll come back to that poem in a minute. But first, let's understand what this term Aztlan, A-Z-T-L-A-N, is in reference to. And if we had the slide projection of the U.S.-Mexico history, and so we wonder that big land transfer, that moment in history which is so crucial. Aztlan has long been a symbolic portrait of homeland of the indigenous Aztec people from this region. And it's part myth, part history, part cultural roots that project a perfect sense of home that has been lifted from that cultural history. Okay, let me just back up and say Aztlan was a place of origin, a historic setting off point or homeland for the Aztec people. The well-known story of the Aztecs moving from here, moving to look for the symbol of the eagle devouring the serpent on the cactus to find their new home, is what was the impetus behind their movement into modern-day Mexico City. This was, and Anzaldua does give us a part of this story as well. But what the 20th century resurrection of the Aztlan concept brings about is the idea that the homeland resides presumably somewhere in what is today the American Southwest. And so it suggests that Aztec origin and mestizo and modern-day Mexican origin is rooted to some place in that sort of landscape. And this is the idea behind Anzaldua's calling it the homeland. So when she begins that poem by standing, and I don't know if you caught this, by standing on the border, looking across into Mexico. She's in the San Diego-Tijuana area. Looking across, she finds that brown blood in her, she says, rising. The history, the past begins to rise, and she feels compelled by this. Okay, she begins by sort of contemplating what the United States and Mexico history has been, and she calls it a wound, an open wound. She says this in both English and Spanish. Okay, and so in this area, by the time she gets to the prose section, she says, the United States and Mexico butt up against each other. They create an open wound. And in this wound, this is the borderlands, which she distinguishes from a border, which is a literal line. A borderlands is less definitive. And she says those that live here in this less definitive area are perverse. They're squint-eyed. She uses the Spanish word atravesados, okay, which is translatable to something like outsiders or those who don't belong. And she lists a long line of them. And so the Chicano, the presumably half Mexican, half American identity becomes a part of this less than desirable identity. And so Anzaldua wants to go in and discuss why that is created the way that it has. And so she tracks up this history. The history that we went through by looking at the United States and Mexico, but also the history of immigration. She includes the personal memory of the lost land and connects it to modern immigration. And then by the time she gets to the end of the chapter, she's making it very specifically about Mexican women, okay, which is what opens into the rest of her book, which we're not reading here, but it's very particular that she notes that the Mexican woman is very specifically at risk. And all of this tying back to the history of the region. She makes mention of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and she makes mention of patterns of immigration and patterns of Texas Ranger violence, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But she also includes, as part of her code switching, as part of her collage effect, a poem about what manifest destiny looked like in the early parts of the United States. And it's celebrated, and it's often taught as a very heroic, epic, how the West was won mentality. And the inclusion of that poem sort of sets off against her personalized, no, wait a minute tone that she wants to set up here. And I'll give you this information as a side note. Many people, in reading the entirety of the Borderlands book, will look at it and say she carries a lot of anger and she has a lot of emotion. And we look at that and we pull that out and we begin to wonder exactly how she uses that anger and that emotion as a part of her narrative strategy. And she's very unapologetic. Okay. One other thing about this Borderlands piece, this Homeland Aslan, before moving on, in looking at history and personal narrative, okay, you've got what we sometimes refer to as straight-up history, right? Like history you would learn in textbooks, alongside a personal narrative, right? The poem, the personal memory, this and that. What you do is you create a symbiotic relationship between the two, and you recognize that your personal history, in this case Anzaldua's, aligns with communal history, and therefore there are going to be similarities between her audience reading this and her, but not everything will be similar, right? And in fact, depending on audience identity, none of it may be similar. And so when she switches in between something like, let's say, Spanish and English, she creates a sense of audience in those that don't speak Spanish or those that only speak marginal Spanish. She's defining who receives that information by doing that. And that might be something that is a representation of her experience. So that's very, very important to keep in mind. Let's shift gears here and then let's look at the Americo Paredes piece. Okay, so if we're looking at Anzaldua's published book in 1987, but it goes back and it's looking at history from the conquest on, Paredes' book is looking at some events that happened right around the turn of the 20th century. Americo Paredes, born in 1915, died in the late 1990s. I think it was 1990. I'm not sure. Born in Brownsville, Texas, that area that we were looking at, that disputed Texas area, the border, the Rio Grande Valley, where Anzaldua was born. Paredes was born there as well. And he was born in 1915. So if we're looking at history, we're looking at another important moment in Mexico-U.S. history, which is right into the heart of the Mexican Revolution, which is going on at this time in all parts of Mexico and even sort of bleeding over into Texas as well. His name is very unusual. He's named after the 16th century geographer, explorer, Americo Vespucci. He grew up, like Anzaldua, child of manual labor, working in the fields as a rancher alongside his father. One of the things, and Paredes is a giant in Latino studies, in early Latino studies especially, one of the biggest names to come out of the early part of what would be cultural studies and ethnic studies. He even jokes sometimes about being called the grandfather of this type of studies. Well, one of them anyway. As a young boy growing up in the Mexican, or the Texas-Mexican Valley region, he listened to the stories of the area. He listened to the songs called corridos, corridos, which are border ballads, and the folk tales and oral traditions, and he was very attracted to these, and he would later go on to write his own stories and sing his own songs and study these when he eventually went to college. He was one of the first Latino PhDs in the country, receiving his PhD in 1956 from the University of Texas. And what's interesting about that is all those tales, all those songs, all those border ballads that he listened to as a young boy, he turned those into something that could be studied academically. And he wrote his PhD dissertation about one of the most famous border ballads, or corrido, of the region, called The Ballad of a Man Named Gregorio Cortez. That dissertation was focused on the song itself, right? What are the lyrics of the song? And I will put those up onto your Blackboard page so you can have a look at them. But also, what are the variations of the song? What was the historical sense of the time around these events? What is the sort of scholarly way of looking at the creation of border balladry? All of that into something that could be academically studied. And so thereby almost single-handedly creating a Latino studies or ethnic studies model. Okay? So what we have here is a chapter from that dissertation, which would go on to be published and widely circulated. The larger piece is called With His Pistol in His Hand, and he's talking about Cortez, the man who stands up to the Texas Rangers and the sheriff with his pistol in his hand, in a sense of resisting what's going on in the area rather than just submitting to it. So I have another PowerPoint presentation that I'd like you to take a look at. It's one concerning the Texas Rangers, who figure into the Paredes study a little bit more. So if you open that PowerPoint up, we'll go through this one quickly. The Rangers were founded by a man very famous in Texas named Stephen Austin. Yes, he's the Austin who is the namesake of the capital city. He founded the Rangers in 1823, and he had a history in this area as a pioneer and as one of the first men to settle in the area as well. Austin founded the Rangers largely because if you look at this Texas map, the Apaches and the Comanches and other Indians in the area were dominant. And so Austin founded the Rangers under the auspices of protecting Anglo settlers in the area. And he started with a very small band. If you go to slide number 3, the original group of the Texas Rangers was made up of just 10 frontiersmen, and they all look like just that, frontiersmen, pioneers, not necessarily trained lawmen or military men. Go to slide number 4. A few years later, 1835, they become an officially recognized law organization with badges and structure and supposedly rules and guidelines. Some of the weapons that they would use here, these are obviously replications, but 6-shooters, rifles, lariats, Bowie knives, a big Bowie knife named after another famous Texan. These would be the weapons that they would carry. Some contemporary writing from the time describes Rangers in this sort of heroic ride like Mexicans, shoot like Tennesseans, and fight like the very devil. They were seen as the least expensive manner to protect settlers along the frontier. This was largely their way of remaining sort of mobile and a man on a horse. And it also gives rise to a lot of sort of myth creation, right? We have the modern day meaning 20th century version of the Lone Ranger. And even myths of the time would have been one ranger riding into a town and the people asking them, they only sent one ranger, and the ranger's response being, well, there's only one riot, isn't there? This sort of mythologizing. If you go to slide number 7, once that U.S.-Mexican War ended in 1848, the Rangers were no longer needed to protect the border. Right, the border had been reestablished and the military had moved into the area. So now their mission was turned largely on capturing outlaws and protecting against the Indian raids in that area. Slide number 8 shows us many Rangers then shifted over to the Confederate Army during the Civil War, and in Mexico itself began a sort of organized subversiveness to the local law establishment and really began to take the law into their own hands. And there's a couple of examples of massacres there specifically targeted at Mexicans in the area. And the term Texas justice, which we think of as being sort of renegade and over the top and strong-armed forms of justice, arises during this time as well. And there's a couple of incidents there that you can read on slide number 8. Slide number 9, Rangers grew in power. Rangers were often at the whim of powerful white landowners, and this is very, very important historically. The King Ranch was a very large ranch at the center of many of these Texas land and other disputes in the area, and the Rangers were sort of subservient to the owners of the ranch because of the money and the power that they maintained. So they grew corrupt in a lot of ways. Here we have a picture on the left of Americo Paredes, and on the right, a man who was his contemporary at the University of Texas, a man by the name of Walter Prescott Webb. Paredes, in his study, like the one that he did for his dissertation and others that went after, attacks historians like this man, Walter Prescott Webb, because of their sort of celebratory and heroic treatment of people blindly worshiping American westernized views of the history of this time, along with the Texas Rangers, right? Cite them as this sort of, these are the reasons why we won the West, and they were upright and moral and completely good in all of these ways that suggest the heroic cowboy. And Paredes tears that down a little bit and suggests that these historians are blindly following some other stereotypes of the West. If you go to slide 11, you'll see that Paredes summarizes the various attitudes inherent in the contrast of ethnicities in Texas at this time, and you can read through those. But this is a sort of summary of the spirit of that time, right? The Mexican is cruel by nature, and so on and so forth. And thankfully, the heroic white Texan rose up and fought him off. Last slide, number 12. In 1935, Texas Rangers folded into the Texas Department of Public Safety and create a division of the Texas Highway Patrol. And today, because they're such a historical, symbolic law office, they've been protected, and they will not be disbanded anytime soon. And I've included a couple of iconic representations of the Texas Ranger in our American cultural narrative, right? The Lone Ranger on the left, Walker Texas Ranger in the middle, and the baseball team known as the Texas Rangers on the right. If you turn this around and you look at Paredes' chapter, The Legend, this is a piece of his study on the border ballad of Gregorio Cortés. Cortés was a man who was approached by a sheriff and a sheriff's deputy who aimed to arrest him and his brother for stealing a horse. Through a series of mistakes brought about by not being able to translate, not being able to communicate across languages, which is an important point, the sheriff shoots Cortés's brother. And Cortés, believing that he will be shot, reacting in anger and self-defense, shoots the sheriff down. And the deputy runs off from there and expresses this news to everybody, and all of a sudden you've got a renegade Mexican who will be coming after all of them, according to this deputy's story. And this becomes the onset of a chase, a manhunt through the region for Cortés, who eludes the posse of Texas Rangers and other lawmen for several weeks, and hides among the people and rides and escapes and creates this sort of heroic renegade hero for the Mexican people, this symbol of standing up. And thus the line from the song, with his pistol in his hand, represents resistance in the face of what had long been simply being abused and mistreated at the hands of the corrupt law officials. So that's why the song grows out of this story. And the chapter I've chosen to have you read is one that's called The Legend, which really begins to probe into the sort of mythologizing of Cortés. Along with this chapter, Paredes also includes a chapter called The Man, which looks specifically at the realities of Cortés and the things that happen. In our chapter that we read, we see the sort of heroic and inspirational qualities. This man can do no wrong. He's the best horse rider in the land. He's a Robin Hood and all. This idea behind him as being altruistic and incapable of wrong is what created a sense of pride and inspiration that grew into the border ballad, largely because the history of that time was very, very oppressive. And the Texas Rangers were a component of that oppression. So for Paredes to look at Cortés as a early symbol of fighting back, is part of the growing sense of Chicano civil rights that Paredes was at the onset of. When he was writing this in the mid to late 50s, he was thinking about historical figures that represented the idea of change on the horizon. So this history, this moment, and these events happened 1902 in South Texas, I believe. This moment in history is a moment for Paredes to look back and see where are some moments where Mexican Americans, Chicanos, begin to assert themselves, and how can we begin to chart how those are celebrated. And the corrido, the border ballad, was the first form of really telling story. And so to tell Cortés's story was to begin to distribute the idea of standing up for yourself, which 50, 60, 70, 100 years later has grown into something quite different. If you look at both of these pieces, the Anzaldua and the Paredes piece, as components of history, they're also sort of humanity's examples of how we look at the growth of the Chicano identity in relation to history. Remember, Anzaldua takes her personal essay and aligns it with the sort of more standard textbook essay and comes up with something explanatory. Paredes is doing a very similar thing by looking at this one man at a historical moment in history and aligning it with where the civil rights needs of his time are, as he sees them, progressing. So this is why we read these two pieces here at the onset of our class.